The wind cut through Trinity Falls like a knife looking for bone. 15 below, maybe colder. Rose Ellen Hartley's breath made clouds in the gray dawn as she walked the last mile toward the schoolhouse, her left boot sole flapping open with each step. The frozen mud crunched loud enough to wake the dead. She didn't cry. 9 years old, and she'd learned that much already. Inside the one-room schoolhouse, wood smoke mixed with the smell of chalk dust and wet wool. 20 children turned to watch her track mud across the floor. Mrs. Grissom stopped mid-lesson, her mouth going thin. "Class?" the teacher said, holding up Rose Ellen's boot by 2 fingers like it carried disease. "Observe what happens when families lack discipline." The laughter hit sharp as breaking ice. Rose Ellen's face went stone still. She was made to stand in the corner facing the wall, while the boot dangled from Mrs. Grissom's hand like evidence at a trial. Across the street, through the courthouse window, Jacob Brennan watched it all. 23 years old, broad-shouldered from breaking horses, and he couldn't move. His hand tightened on the window frame until the wood creaked. Behind him, his father's voice came quiet. "Son, what's a life worth if you don't pay your debts?" Jacob didn't answer. Couldn't. Rose Ellen walked home through the blue shadows of late afternoon, her breath still making clouds. 4 miles. The new boots Mrs. Grissom had mocked were back on her feet now, but they didn't keep out the cold that came from inside. The Hartley homestead sat in a shallow valley where sage met pine. 40 acres her father had claimed before the railroad came through, before he died under a freight wagon in a mountain pass 3 winters back. The cabin looked smaller every time she saw it, like the prairie was swallowing it whole. She found Aunt Ida collapsed by the woodpile. The old woman lay on her side in the snow, one hand still clutching the axe handle. Her lips had gone blue. Rose Ellen dropped to her knees, pressing her ear to her aunt's chest. The heartbeat came thin and irregular, like a clock winding down. She ran. 2 miles to Doc Calloway's place, her torn boot forgotten, lungs burning in the cold air. She pounded on his door until he answered, black bag already in hand before she could speak. He'd been expecting this, she realized. Everyone had. Doc's wagon creaked over the frozen ruts. He didn't talk, just drove, and Rose Ellen was grateful for the silence. When they reached the cabin, he carried Aunt Ida inside with surprising gentleness for a man with hands like tree roots. Rose Ellen built up the fire while Doc worked. The smell of kerosene and camphor filled the small space. After a long while, he straightened and motioned her outside. The stars were coming out, hard and bright. 6 months, Doc said quietly, his breath clouding. "Maybe less if the cold holds. Her heart's failing, child, has been for a year." Rose Ellen nodded. She'd known the way you know winter's coming by the slant of light. "Can't pay you now," she said. "But I will, somehow." Doc Calloway looked at her for a long moment. "Your father once drove supplies through a blizzard when my nephew was dying of fever. Never asked for a cent." He closed his bag with a snap. "Some debts don't need paying, they just need passing on." He left her standing in the cold. Inside, Aunt Ida slept fitfully. Rose Ellen sat by the fire, mending the torn boot with twine that wouldn't hold past tomorrow. Through the window, she could see the lights of Trinity Falls, warm and distant as stars. Sunday came bitter cold. The church was packed, bodies pressed together for warmth. Rose Ellen and Aunt Ida sat in the back pew, their worn coats standing out among the Sunday best. Reverend Thomas preached about mercy and the meek inheriting the earth, but his eyes slid past them like water off waxed canvas. The service ended. People filed out into the pale sunlight, their chatter filling the cold air with steam. Rose Ellen helped Aunt Ida stand, the old woman's weight nearly nothing now. That's when Silas Wexler stepped in front of them. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with a face like a banker, counting other people's money. In his hand, he held a folded document, official-looking, with a red seal. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm serving notice of foreclosure on the homestead. 90 days to settle your outstanding debts, or the property reverts to territorial holding." He smiled. "That's the law, ma'am." Aunt Ida took the paper with shaking hands. She couldn't read well, never had been able to, but she understood enough. Around them, the congregation went quiet, watching like it was a stage play put on for their entertainment. Reverend Thomas stood on the church steps. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Said nothing. Wexler leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper only Rose Ellen could hear. "Orphan train leaves in 90 days, girl. Best pack light." He walked away, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The crowd dispersed slowly, heads down, nobody meeting Rose Ellen's eyes. She stood there, holding Aunt Ida upright, the foreclosure notice crackling in the wind like dead leaves. That evening, the Brennan family sat down to Sunday dinner. roast venison, potatoes, bread still warm from the oven. Old man Brennan said grace, then carved the meat in silence. Jacob pushed food around his plate, not eating. "Something on your mind, son?" his father asked. Jacob looked up. "The Hartley girl, at church. Wexler served foreclosure." His father nodded slowly, chewing. "Heard about that. Doesn't seem right. Lots of things aren't right." Old man Brennan set down his knife. "Your mother always said we owed the Hartleys. Guess that debt dies with the old woman." "What debt?" His father looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in his weathered face. "Ask me again when you're ready to do something about it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. In the Hartley cabin, Rose Ellen covered Aunt Ida with every blanket they owned and lay awake listening to the wind test the walls, wondering how many more nights the cold would hold. The saloon smelled like tobacco and spilled whiskey. Jacob had ridden into town to pick up grain seed, but something made him tie his horse outside the Lucky Dollar instead. Through the dirty window, he could see Silas Wexler holding court at a corner table. Jacob pushed through the door. The warmth hit him first, then the noise. He moved to the bar, ordered coffee he didn't want, and listened. Wexler's voice carried easy in the close space. "Railroad's coming through next spring. Survey's already done. Right-of-way runs straight through the Hartley property." He laughed, a sound like coins counting. $2,000 per acre, boys. That's what they're paying. Tyler Brooks, the county clerk, leaned in. He was Wexler's brother-in-law, a fact everyone knew, but nobody mentioned. "What about the old woman's claim? 40 acres at $2,000 per?" Wexler drew on his cigar. "That's $80,000 sitting on land a dying woman can't hold. Law's on my side." "What if the girl finds the old man's land patent?" Tyler asked, his voice dropping. "Original claim papers would complicate things." Wexler blew smoke toward the ceiling. "Won't matter. I already paid the clerk." Tyler grinned. "Paid him well." Jacob's hand tightened on his coffee cup. The ceramic creaked, but didn't break. He left coins on the bar and walked out into the cold. His horse stamped, impatient. Jacob stood there in the street, watching the lights of the saloon, watching the courthouse across the square, watching the whole rotten structure of the thing. The next morning, Rose Ellen walked to the courthouse carrying a cloth bundle. Inside were her father's papers, everything she could find in the cabin's single trunk: bills of sale, freight receipts, a letter from the Territorial Land Office. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was his original claim document from 1879. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper. Her boots squeaked on the polished wood. Tyler Brooks sat behind a high desk, looking down at her like a judge at sentencing. "Help you, girl?" She unwrapped the bundle carefully. "I need to file these, proof of my father's claim." Tyler took the papers, barely glancing at them. He made a show of checking a large ledger, running his finger down columns of names. Hartley. No record of a Hartley claim on file. But those papers, these? He held up her father's patent, the one Thomas Hartley had carried from Helena after standing in line for 6 hours in 1879. "This isn't properly registered. See here? The legal description's incomplete." He pointed to a section that was perfectly clear. "Can't help you without proper documents, girl. Law's the law." He set the papers down on his desk, then made a show of organizing other documents on top of them. When Rose Ellen reached for her father's bundle, Tyler's hand came down flat. "These need to stay here for verification. Come back next week." "But they're mine." "Next week." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Rose Ellen stood there, 9 years old in a courthouse built to make children feel small. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the silence. The door opened behind her. Jacob Brennan walked in, his hat in his hands. "Morning, Tyler. I need to check the property records for the western grazing section." Tyler's expression flickered, something between annoyance and worry. "Come back this afternoon, Brennan. I'm busy." "I can wait." Jacob moved to the bench along the wall, settling in like he had all day. Tyler stared at him, then at Rose Ellen. "Girl, I said next week. Move along now." Rose Ellen looked at the papers on Tyler's desk, her father's life reduced to documents she couldn't reclaim. She walked to the door on legs that didn't feel like her own. Outside, the sun was bright on the snow, blinding. She sat down on the courthouse steps, and for the first time since her father died, she let the tears come. They froze on her cheeks almost immediately. The door opened. Jacob came out, stopped when he saw her. He stood there awkward, a man better with horses than words. "He won't give them back," Rose Ellen said. "My father's papers." Jacob's jaw tightened. He looked back at this courthouse door, then down at her. "I know. Everyone knows. Nobody does anything. He had no answer for that. The truth of it sat between them like a third person. Jacob started to speak, then stopped. He put his hat back on and walked down the steps. Rose Ellen watched him go, watched him untie his horse and mount up, watched him sit there in the saddle for a long moment, looking back at the courthouse, at her, at something she couldn't see. Then he rode away. She sat there until the cold worked through her coat, through her dress, into her bones. The tears had stopped, but the salt tracks remained, frozen reminders. When she finally stood, her legs were stiff, her torn boot sole flapping again where the twine had given way. The walk home took forever. That night, Aunt Ida asked her about the papers. Rose Ellen lied and said they were filed, everything was fine. The old woman nodded and dozed off, too tired to question it. Rose Ellen lay awake in the dark, listening to her aunt's labored breathing, counting the days until spring, 90 days, 89 now. The orphan train left on schedule, rain or shine. The mercantile smelled like dried beans and calico fabric. Maria Santos stood behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back, her hands busy with inventory. She looked up when the bell over the door jangled, and her expression softened when she saw Rose Ellen. "Morning, child." Rose Ellen approached the counter slowly, pulling something from her coat pocket. Her father's silver pocket watch, the one thing of value they owned. The case was dented, but the mechanism still worked, keeping time like it mattered. "How much?" Rose Ellen asked. Maria took the watch, opened it, read the inscription inside. "Pass it on when your time comes. T.H." She closed it with a gentle snap and set it back on the counter. "No. Please, ma'am. Aunt Ida needs medicine, and your father had credit here." Maria's voice was firm. "Still does, far as I'm concerned." She disappeared into the back room and returned with a pair of sturdy boots, child-sized, hardly worn. "These belonged to my youngest before he outgrew them. They'll fit you." Rose Ellen stared at the boots. Real leather, good soles, no holes. "I can't." "You can." Maria came around the counter and knelt down, helping Rose Ellen out of the torn boots and into the new ones. They fit perfectly, warm and solid. "Your father once drove supplies through a blizzard when my boy had fever, saved his life." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "This settles it." Rose Ellen's throat went tight. "Thank you." Maria's hand rested briefly on her shoulder. "And girl?" She leaned close, her voice dropping. "I keep records. Every transaction, every payment, every debt, written down proper, with dates." She glanced toward the door, making sure they were alone. "Your father never owed anybody a cent. Paid in full, 1881. Whatever Wexler's claiming is a lie, and I can prove it." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading out. "Why tell me?" "Because lies only work when nobody writes down the truth." Maria returned to the counter, her hands moving over the ledger book that sat there, thick and worn. "When the time comes, you remember that." Rose Ellen walked out into the February cold in boots that didn't leak, carrying hope she didn't quite trust yet. That same afternoon, Jacob rode the fence line on his father's ranch, checking for winter damage. The work was good for thinking, or not thinking, depending on what a man needed. The wind had died down, and the sun was almost warm on his back. He found his father, in the breaking corral, watching a young stallion test the fence. "Need to talk to you," Jacob said, dismounting. Old man Brennan didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the horse. "About the Hartleys." "How'd you know?" "You've been chewing on something for 3 days. Your mother used to get the same look." He finally turned, his weathered face unreadable. "You want the story?" Jacob nodded. "Winter of 75. You were 15, thought you knew everything." His father's voice went quiet, remembering. "You took the northern trail to check the high pasture, against my advice. Storm came in fast. Temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. You didn't make it back." Jacob remembered the cold, remembered his horse going lame, remembered lying in the snow thinking this was how it ended. "Thomas Hartley found you. Freighter heading home from a delivery, could have kept going. It was 20 below, snow coming down so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. He was 3 hours from his own cabin, but he turned around." Old man Brennan's voice caught. "Carried you 6 miles on his back. Near killed him doing it. Got you here just before midnight." The wind moved through the corral, stirring up dust. "He stayed the night. Made sure you'd live. In the morning, your mother tried to pay him. He refused. Said something I never forgot. Don't want payment, just pass it on when your time comes." His father's eyes finally met his. "Your mother begged me to help his family after he died. I said we had our own troubles. She died still ashamed of me for that. Don't you carry that weight, son. Don't you wait till someone's gone to do right. Jacob looked at his hands, at the reins he'd been gripping too tight. What do I do? That's not for me to say anymore. You're a man now. You decide what kind. His father walked away, leaving Jacob alone with the young stallion and the memory of cold so deep it stopped time. That night, Jacob lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling beams. Through the wall, he could hear his father's snoring, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, an owl called once, twice, then silence. He thought about Rose Ellen, sitting on those courthouse steps, tears freezing on her face. Thought about Tyler Brooks shuffling her father's papers like a card dealer. Thought about Wexler in the saloon, counting other people's land like it was already his. Thought about a man carrying another man's son through a blizzard because it was right. 6 miles, 20 below, no payment asked. Jacob got out of bed and lit the lamp. From the bottom of his trunk, he pulled out his father's old surveying tools, compass, chain, level, brass instruments gone dark with age but still true. He set them on the table and stared at them in the lamplight. His father's voice came through the door, not asleep after all. You planning to use those or just look at them? Haven't decided yet. Then you're still afraid. The words hit like a fist. Jacob blew out the lamp and lay back down in the dark, the tools gleaming faintly in the moonlight through the window. Afraid, yes, of failing again, of being too late, of carrying another death he couldn't fix. But Thomas Hartley had been afraid too, probably. Turned around anyway. Dawn came, gray and cold. Rose Ellen woke to the sound of hammering. She pulled on her new boots, still strange, still solid, and stepped outside. 3 men stood by the cabin, one of them nailing a painted sign to the doorframe. The wood was fresh-cut pine, the letters crude but clear. Condemned, unsafe structure. Aunt Ida appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt, her face pale as snow. What's this? The man with the hammer didn't look at her. County order, ma'am. Building's been assessed as unsafe for habitation. You got 30 days to vacate. This is my home. Not anymore. He finished the last nail with 3 hard strikes, then stepped back to admire his work. The other 2 men, hired muscle from the look of them, stood with arms crossed, daring anyone to argue. Rose Ellen recognized one of them from the saloon, one of Wexler's crew. Who sent you? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Does it matter, little girl? Aunt Ida swayed. Rose Ellen caught her before she fell, the old woman's weight nearly pulling them both down. The men laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and climbed into their wagon. The wheels creaked away down the frozen track. Rose Ellen helped her aunt back inside. Through the window she could see the sign, official and damning. The cabin her father had built with his own hands, condemned by men who'd never lifted an axe in their lives. She got Aunt Ida settled by the fire, then walked to the nearest neighbor's place. 2 miles across open prairie, wind cutting through her coat. Miguel Santos answered the door, Maria's brother-in-law, a good man by reputation. Please, Rose Ellen said. They put a sign on our cabin, said it's condemned. I need... Miguel's face went soft with something like pity, something like shame. I'm sorry, child. I can't help you. Just someone to witness what they did. Just... Wexler owns the note on my property, too. I cause him trouble. I lose everything. He looked past her at the empty prairie, anywhere but her eyes. I got 3 children, you understand? She understood. She walked to 2 more homesteads, got the same answer, different words. By the time she turned back toward Trinity Falls, the sun was high and pale, giving light but no warmth. The school day was nearly over when she arrived. Through the window she could see Mrs. Grissom at the blackboard. The children bent over their slates. Rose Ellen pushed open the door, every head turned. The whispers started immediately, a sound like wind through dead grass. Mrs. Grissom's mouth went thin. You're late, Miss Hartley. I don't recall asking for excuses. The teacher pointed to the corner, where Rose Ellen's old desk had been moved. Your new seat, facing the wall, I think, will help you concentrate on your studies. 20 children watched as Rose Ellen walked to the corner. Someone had carved words into the desk. Charity case. She sat down, her back to the room, her face to the blank wall. Behind her, lessons continued. Geography, the capitals of the territories, how Montana might become a state someday, if enough good people settled it. At recess, no one would stand near her. The children clustered by the stove, their parents' warnings clear in their avoidance. Rose Ellen stood alone by the window, looking out at the street. Jacob was there, across the way, standing in front of the courthouse. She watched him for a long moment, watched him look at the schoolhouse, watched his hand tighten on something she couldn't see. Then he took one step forward, their eyes met through the glass. Something passed between them, a question maybe, or a promise. Jacob took another step, then he stopped, his shoulders sagged. He turned and walked the other way, disappearing around the corner toward the livery stable. Rose Ellen stood at the window long after he was gone, long after the other children had been called back inside. Mrs. Grissom had to say her name twice before she moved. That afternoon passed like a jail sentence. When the bell finally rang, Rose Ellen gathered her things, a slate, a stub of chalk, nothing else, and walked out into the cold. The sun was already dropping toward the mountains, the shadows going long and blue. She walked the 4 miles home in the new boots that no longer felt like a gift, just a reminder that charity had limits. When she reached the cabin, she found Aunt Ida at the table, staring at the foreclosure notice like it might change if she looked hard enough. "We could go to Helena," the old woman said. "I got a cousin there. Maybe she'd—" "She hasn't answered your letters in 3 years. Or the fort. They need laundresses, kitchen help. You can barely stand, Aunt Ida." The truth sat between them, heavy as stones. Aunt Ida's hands shook as she folded the paper, creased it sharp, folded it again. Outside, the wind picked up, testing the walls, finding the cracks. "Your father would know what to do," she whispered. But her father was 3 years dead, and knowing what to do didn't matter anymore. Only doing it mattered. And Rose Ellen was 9 years old with no money, no claim, and 87 days until the orphan train. She lay awake that night, listening to Aunt Ida's breathing go rough and shallow. Through the walls, she could hear the wind. Through the window, she could see the stars, cold and distant. Somewhere out there, Trinity Falls slept warm in its houses, doors locked, consciences quiet. And across town, in a room above his father's barn, Jacob Brennan sat at a table with a lamp burning low. In front of him lay the surveying tools, compass, chain, level, instruments his father had used to map this land before the railroad came, before men like Wexler learned you could steal with paper instead of guns. He picked up the compass. The brass was cold in his hand, the needle swinging to magnetic north like it always had, true and certain. His father had taught him to use these when he was 12, how to measure distance, how to read elevation, how to turn the land into numbers that lawyers could understand, how to prove what belonged to who. Jacob set the compass down and rubbed his face with both hands. Outside, his father's horses stamped in their stalls, restless. An owl called from the barn rafters. The lamp flickered, throwing shadows that looked like choices. He thought about Rose Ellen at that window, watching him walk away. Thought about her face when she sat on those courthouse steps. Thought about Thomas Hartley turning around in a blizzard, choosing the hard thing because it was right. His brother had drowned because Jacob wasn't there. Because he'd chosen breaking a wild mare over watching a 12-year-old boy fish in a spring-swollen creek. That weight would never lift. But maybe he could choose different this time. Maybe afraid was just another kind of cold you had to walk through. Jacob stood up. He gathered the surveying tools, wrapped them in oilcloth, and set them by the door where he'd see them first thing in the morning. Then he pulled on his coat and walked down to the main house. His father was still up, reading by the fire. He looked up when Jacob entered, and something in the old man's face shifted. "I need to borrow the county land maps," Jacob said. "The ones from before territorial survey." His father marked his place in the book and stood. "What are you planning?" "To beat a man at his own game. You said beat him smart, not hard." "That's what I said." His father walked to the desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside were rolled maps, survey documents, claim records going back to the 1870s. "But smart takes time. That girl doesn't have time." "Then I'll work fast." Old man Brennan handed him the maps. Their hands touched for a moment, grip to grip. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly. "I'm proud." Jacob took the maps and walked back to his room. He spread them on the table, weighted the corners with stones, and lit every lamp he had. The surveying tools gleamed in the light. Outside, the temperature dropped to 0. Inside, Jacob Brennan started measuring the truth. March came in cold and wet, the kind of weather that made a person question spring's promises. Rose Ellen stood in the cabin doorway, looking at the condemned sign. 2 weeks it had been there now, the paint already starting to peel. She stepped outside. The ground was half-frozen mud, winter refusing to let go. Aunt Ida slept inside, her breathing worse, each morning, each night. Doc Calloway came twice a week now, leaving medicine he wouldn't let Rose Ellen pay for. Rose Ellen picked up the broom, bristles worn down to nubs, and started sweeping the porch. It didn't need sweeping. The wind would just blow more dirt tomorrow. But her hands needed work, needed something to do besides count days. 73 left. She swept anyway. Then she scrubbed the cabin floor with lye soap and freezing water until her hands were raw. She mended Aunt Ida's quilts, stitching patches over patches. She hauled water from the creek, breaking through skin ice with a rock. When all that was done, she walked to the old freight wagon her father had left behind, half buried in snow and sage at the edge of the property. The canvas cover had rotted through, the wheels sunk deep in frozen ground. But it was his, and she couldn't let it rot away like everything else. She climbed into the wagon bed, looking for anything useful. Empty crates, a coil of rope gone stiff with age, rusted tools. At the back, beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets, she found a false bottom in the wagon bed. Her father had been a careful man, a man who knew roads weren't always safe. She pried up the board with a broken horseshoe. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden for 3 years, was a bullwhip. Her father's working whip, the one he'd used to move freight teams through narrow mountain passes. She lifted it out carefully. The leather was still supple, dark with oil and use. The handle fit her hand like it was waiting. She tried to crack it the way she'd seen her father do. The whip unfurled, but without force, just leather flopping in the mud. She tried again. Her arms weren't strong enough, her timing wrong. The whip was too heavy, too long, made for a grown man's grip. She coiled it back up and sat there in the wagon bed, holding it. The wind moved through the sage, carrying the smell of distant snow. "I'm not ready yet, Papa," she whispered to the empty air. "But I'm trying." She took the whip back to the cabin and hung it on a nail by the door, where she could see it every morning. A promise, maybe. A reminder that her father had been strong, and she carried his blood. That same week, Jacob spent 3 nights at his table with the maps and surveying tools. His father's land records showed every claim in the valley: boundaries, water rights, territorial grants. Jacob traced his finger along the lines, doing the mathematics his father had taught him. The Hartley homestead. 40 acres, filed in 1879. The boundaries were clear, but when he overlaid Wexler's claim, filed just 6 months ago, something didn't line up. Wexler's eastern boundary cut across a section marked in red: Federal Grazing Allotment, Treaty of 1855. Protected land, set aside for territorial use and tribal access. You couldn't claim it, couldn't sell it, couldn't file private ownership. But Wexler had tried anyway. Jacob sat back, the lamp flickering. A mistake like that wasn't ignorance. It was arrogance. The kind that came from thinking nobody would check, nobody would care, nobody would have the tools or knowledge to prove him wrong. Jacob could prove him wrong, but proof needed a witness, needed someone the territorial court would listen to, not just a rancher's son with maps and a compass. The next morning, Jacob rode into town and tied his horse outside Doc Calloway's house. The doctor answered in his shirt sleeves, smelling like carbolic and coffee. "Jacob Brennan, you sick?" "Need to talk to you about Wexler." Doc's expression changed. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Not here. Walk with me." They walked to the edge of town where the creek ran fast with snowmelt. The sound of water covered their voices. "I've been watching that bastard for 2 years, Doc said quietly. "He bankrupted 6 families the same way. Forged feed bills, false liens, courthouse papers that disappear. My brother was one of them, lost everything, moved to Oregon." His jaw tightened. "My brother put a gun in his mouth 2 winters back. His wife found him." Jacob let the words settle. "I can prove the Hartley claim. Federal survey shows Wexler's boundaries are illegal. But I need someone who will testify." "Testify to who? Tyler Brooks runs the courthouse. Judge Morrison is Wexler's cousin. This whole town's bought and paid for." "Federal marshal, from Helena." Doc looked at him sharp. "You're serious?" "If I can get the marshal here, will you testify? Your records Wexler's pattern, all of it?" Doc Calloway stared at the creek for a long moment. "I've been keeping records, dates, families, amounts, every fraud I could document." He turned to Jacob. "You get a federal man here, I'll testify. But son, Wexler's got reach. You go after him, he won't stop at foreclosure." "I know." "Do you?" Doc's eyes were hard. "He'll come after your family, your father's ranch, everything you've built. You sure you want this fight?" Jacob thought about Rose Ellen sitting on those courthouse steps, tears freezing on her face. Thought about his brother's body pulled from the creek, cold and blue. Thought about Thomas Hartley carrying him 6 miles through a blizzard. "I'm sure." Doc nodded slowly. Then we're in it together. They shook hands there by the creek, the water running fast and cold, carrying winter downstream. That afternoon, Jacob stopped by the mercantile. Maria Santos was arranging canned goods on a high shelf, standing on a step stool. "Mrs. Santos, need a word." She climbed down, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jacob Brennan, your mother used to buy fabric from me. You look like her around the eyes. I'm trying to help Rose Ellen Hartley keep her homestead." Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. "What do you need?" "Your ledger, the one that shows Thomas Hartley's accounts." "Why?" "Because Wexler's claiming the Hartleys owe him money. Feed debt, he says. $240. Maria's mouth went thin. "That's a lie. Thomas Hartley paid every bill in full. I've got receipts going back to 1879. She walked to the counter and pulled out her ledger, thick as a Bible and twice as detailed. Every transaction, every payment, dated and signed. She opened it to the Hartley page. The final entry read, "Paid in full, November 1881. Can I borrow this?" "No." She closed the ledger. "But when the time comes, when you've got someone official who'll listen, I'll bring it myself, and I'll testify. Wexler could make trouble for you. Let him try." Her eyes were hard as creek stones. "That little girl's father saved my son's life. I won't hide behind my counter while she loses hers." Jacob rode home as the sun dropped behind the mountains, turning the snow gold and then blue. The wind had shifted south, carrying the first hint of warmth. In another month, the high pastures would open up. In another month, the wildflowers would bloom. In another month, Rose Ellen Hartley would be on a train headed east if he failed. He wouldn't fail. Couldn't. Not this time. That night, in the Hartley cabin, Aunt Ida woke coughing. Rose Ellen helped her sit up, held the water cup while she drank. The old woman's hands shook, her skin thin as paper. "I'm sorry, child," Aunt Ida whispered. "I'm so sorry I can't." "Hush now, rest. Promise me something. Anything." "When I'm gone," Aunt Ida's breath rattled. "Don't let them make you ashamed. Your father was a good man. You're his daughter. Hold on to that." Rose Ellen held her aunt's hand until she slept again. Then she walked to the door and looked at her father's bullwhip hanging on the nail. 69 days left. She'd hold on. April brought mud and cold rain that fell like spite. The schoolhouse roof leaked in 3 places, tin buckets catching the drips with a steady rhythm that made concentration impossible. Rose Ellen sat at her desk in the corner, copying her letters on a slate while water drummed overhead. Mrs. Grissom stood at the front of the class, her voice sharp as a knife, looking for something to cut. "Children, we'll now discuss the importance of moral character in frontier society." She looked directly at Rose Ellen. "Some families, through poor planning and lack of discipline, find themselves in unfortunate circumstances. This is not bad luck. This is consequence." The classroom went quiet except for the rain. "Miss Morrison," the teacher continued, addressing the mayor's daughter, "what happens to children whose families cannot provide for them?" "They go to orphanages, ma'am, or on trains to find new families." "Correct. The orphan train system is a mercy, really, placing unfortunate children with good Christian families who can teach them proper values." Mrs. Grissom's eyes stayed on Rose Ellen. "It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's an opportunity." Rose Ellen's hand tightened on her chalk until it cracked. At recess, she stood alone in the rain while the other children huddled under the eaves. She didn't mind the wet anymore. It was cleaner than their looks, colder than their whispers, more honest than their pity. When she walked home that afternoon, her new boots were caked with mud. The 4 miles felt like 40. She arrived to find Aunt Ida sitting at the table, staring at a piece of paper. "What's that?" The old woman looked up, her eyes red. "Came this morning from Mrs. Adelaide Crane, the orphan train coordinator." Her voice broke. "She'll be in Trinity Falls on May 15th to collect any children in need of placement." Rose Ellen took the paper. The words swam. "Regret to inform you, arrangements have been made. Best interests of the child." May 15th, 6 weeks. That evening the rain stopped but the cold stayed. Rose Ellen walked to the wagon again, climbed inside, and took down her father's bullwhip. She'd been practicing in secret, her arms getting stronger, her timing improving. The leather was starting to remember her grip. She cracked it once in the empty air. The sound split the twilight like thunder. Better. Not good yet, but better. In town, Jacob stood in the Trinity Falls Saloon, a place he rarely visited. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed men. He'd come because he'd heard Wexler would be here tonight, and he needed to see what he was up against. Wexler sat at his usual table, holding court. 3 men surrounded him, hired muscle, not local boys. They had the look of men who'd done worse than intimidation. Men brought in from elsewhere for work. Decent folks wouldn't do. "The Hartley place will be clear by May," Wexler was saying, his voice carrying. "Railroad will break ground in June. By this time next year, that land will be worth triple what the old man paid for it." One of the hired men leaned in. "What about the girl?" "Train takes her east. Problem solved." Wexler drank, smiled. "Clean and legal. That's how you do it, boys. No mess, no fuss, no evidence." Jacob's hand went to his hip, instinct reaching for something that wasn't there. He wasn't armed. He'd come to listen, not fight, but every muscle in his body wanted to walk over to that table and... "Easy, son." Doc Calloway's hand landed on Jacob's shoulder. The old doctor had appeared beside him like a ghost. "Not here. Not like this. You heard what he said. I heard, and I'll remember every word when it matters." Doc guided Jacob toward the door. "Come on, I've got something to show you." They walked through the muddy streets to Doc's house. Inside, the physician pulled a wooden crate from under his bed. It was full of papers, letters, receipts, sworn statements. 2 years of evidence, Doc said. 6 families ruined the exact same way. Forged debt claims, disappearing documents, foreclosures filed the day after families buried their dead. He spread the papers on the table. "I've been waiting for someone who could actually do something with this." Jacob studied the documents. The pattern was clear. Wexler targeted widows, orphans, anyone vulnerable. The amounts were always just high enough to force foreclosure, but low enough to seem plausible. And the timing was always the same. Winter, when people were desperate, when fighting back seemed impossible. "This is enough," Jacob said. "This plus Maria's ledger, plus the survey maps showing his claims illegal, it's enough if we can get it to someone who'll listen. But the territorial court's in his pocket." Doc closed the crate carefully. "You'll need a federal marshal, and son, they don't come unless you can prove federal jurisdiction." "The grazing allotment. Treaty land. Can you prove his claim overlaps?" Jacob nodded. "I can survey it myself. My father taught me. The tools don't lie." "Then do it. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever you can." "But Jacob..." Doc's face was grave. "Once you file that complaint, once a marshal gets involved, Wexler will know who did it, and he doesn't forgive." "I know. Your father's ranch. I'll handle my father." Doc studied him for a long moment. "You're not that boy who got lost in a blizzard anymore, are you?" "No, sir. I'm the one Thomas Hartley carried home." That night, Jacob and his father rode out to the Hartley homestead with the surveying tools. The mud was thick, the darkness complete except for their lanterns. They worked in silence, measuring boundaries, checking elevations, confirming what the old map said. The eastern boundary of Wexler's claim crossed into federal land by 3 full acres. "That's your proof," Old Man Brennan said, writing down the numbers by lantern light. "That's what'll bring a marshal." They were packing up the tools when they saw lights moving toward them. Riders, 4 of them, coming fast. "Company," Jacob's father said quietly. The riders pulled up 20 feet away. Wexler's hired men, the ones from the saloon. The leader, a man with a scar across his jaw, leaned forward in his saddle. "Little late to be trespassing, ain't it, boys?" "We're on Hartley land," Jacob said. "Legal land, with legal boundaries. Hartley land belongs to Mr. Wexler come May. You're trespassing on his property." "Not how the law works." The scarred man smiled. "Funny thing about law. It's whatever a judge says it is. And Judge Morrison says what Mr. Wexler tells him to say." He spat tobacco into the mud. "Best you boys head home. Wouldn't want any accidents out here in the dark." Jacob's father stepped forward, putting himself between the riders and his son. "We're leaving, but we got what we came for." "Did you now?" The scarred man's eyes went to the surveying tools. "Shame if those got lost. Real shame." They sat on their horses, blocking the path home, making the threat clear as daylight. Jacob picked up the surveying tools and held them close. His father mounted his horse, and slowly, deliberately slow, they rode past the hired men. Jacob felt eyes on his back every step, felt the weight of unspoken violence. When they were out of earshot, his father spoke. "They'll be watching now. Let them watch." "Jacob, I'm riding to Helena tomorrow. Federal marshal needs to hear this before Wexler makes his next move." His father was quiet for a long moment, then, You're your mother's son. She'd be riding with you if she could. They rode home through the mud and darkness, carrying proof that might save a homestead or might just paint targets on their backs. Behind them, the hired men sat their horses and watched until the lanterns disappeared. Sunday morning came with pale sunlight and air that almost felt warm. The church bell rang across Trinity Falls, calling the faithful to worship. Rose Ellen helped Aunt Ida dress, the old woman moving slow as winter ice melting. They walked to church together, Aunt Ida leaning heavy on Rose Ellen's arm. Every step seemed to cost something. By the time they reached the church steps, the old woman was breathing hard, her lips gone pale. Inside, the congregation was already seated. Rose Ellen and Aunt Ida took their usual place in the back pew, heads turned, whispers spreading like fire in dry grass. Nobody moved to make room. Nobody smiled. Reverend Thomas stood at the pulpit, his Bible open, his face carefully blank. He was a thin man, graying at the temples, with hands that shook slightly when he lifted them to pray. The service began. Hymns about mercy and grace, prayers for the sick and suffering. Words that meant everything and nothing, depending on who was listening. Then came the sermon. Today I want to speak about difficult choices, Reverend Thomas said, his voice carrying through the small church. About the burdens we carry, and the compromises we make to survive in this harsh land. Rose Ellen felt Aunt Ida stiffen beside her. Sometimes, the Reverend continued, we must choose between what is right and what is safe, between speaking truth and keeping peace. His eyes moved across the congregation, never quite landing on anyone. And sometimes, God forgive us, we choose safety. The church was silent, except for the creak of pews and the distant sound of wind. I want to tell you about a choice I made. His hands gripped the pulpit. 2 months ago, a man came to me. A powerful man, a generous man. He asked me to write a letter, a character reference, he called it, about a family in our congregation. His voice wavered. He wanted me to say that this family was unfit, morally lacking, undeserving of the land they held. Aunt Ida's breathing stopped. He offered me money, not much, but enough, and he reminded me, in a friendly way, of course, that this church building sits on land he donated, that the bell tower was funded by his family, that certain arrangements could be reconsidered. Someone in the congregation coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. I said I would think about it. Reverend Thomas looked down at his Bible. And I have been thinking about it ever since, thinking about what it means to be a shepherd who protects the wolves because the wolves built the fence. He looked up, and for the first time, his eyes found Rose Ellen. I want to say, before this congregation and before God, that I was wrong to stay silent, wrong to consider that letter, wrong to value a building over a child's future. His voice broke. I chose the building over the people, and that makes me a coward and a failure as a man of God. The silence was complete now, absolute. Rose Ellen stood up. She didn't plan to, her body just moved. Every eye in the church turned to her. My father was a good man, she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. He paid his debts, he helped his neighbors. He saved a man's life in a blizzard and never asked for payment. She looked at Reverend Thomas. You knew him. You know what kind of man he was. I do know, the Reverend said quietly. And I'm sorry, child. I'm so deeply sorry. Sorry doesn't stop the foreclosure. The words came out harder than she meant. Sorry doesn't keep me from that train. No, it doesn't. He stepped down from the pulpit, moving into the aisle. But testimony might, truth might. And I promise you, Rose Ellen Hartley, when the time comes, when there's someone official who'll listen, I will tell the truth about what Silas Wexler asked me to do. Behind Rose Ellen, someone stood, then another, then a dozen people, half the congregation, standing in silence. Wexler wasn't there. He never came to church, but his cousin, Judge Morrison, was. The judge's face had gone red, his jaw tight. He stood and walked out, his boots loud on the wooden floor. The service ended early. People filed out into the spring air, no one quite meeting anyone else's eyes. Rose Ellen helped Aunt Ida down the steps, the old woman crying softly. There now, Rose Ellen whispered. We're all right. But they weren't all right, and both of them knew it. That same morning, 60 miles away, Jacob rode into Helena. The capital was bigger than Trinity Falls, busier, full of territorial officials and businessmen who dressed like they owned the future. He found the federal marshal's office in a brick building near the Capitol. Inside, a deputy sat at a desk, shuffling papers with the enthusiasm of a man doing anything but his job. "Help you?" "Need to speak to Marshal Harrison about land fraud in Trinity Falls." The deputy didn't look up. "Marshal's busy. File a complaint form." "It's federal jurisdiction. Treaty land violation." That got the deputy's attention. He set down his papers and actually looked at Jacob. "You got proof?" Jacob laid out the surveying maps, his father's records, the measurements from the previous night. Silas Wexler filed a claim that overlaps federal grazing allotment, Treaty of 1855, 3 acres of illegal boundary. The deputy studied the documents, his expression shifting from bored to interested. "Wait here." He disappeared into a back office. Jacob stood in the empty room, hat in hands, trying not to think about what would happen if the marshal said no. 10 minutes passed, 20. Then the deputy returned with a telegram form. "Marshal Harrison's in Butte for another week, but I'm sending this now. If your survey's accurate, he'll come." He looked at Jacob seriously. "You know what happens when you accuse a man like Wexler of fraud?" "Yes, sir." "Do you?" The deputy leaned forward. "He'll come after you, your family, everything you own. Federal charges take time, months, maybe. Can you hold out that long?" Jacob thought about Rose Ellen on those courthouse steps, thought about Thomas Hartley in a blizzard, thought about his brother and all the ways a man could fail, and all the ways he might not. "I can hold out." The deputy nodded and filled out the telegram. "Then God help you, son, because you just started a war." Jacob rode back toward Trinity Falls as the sun dropped low, painting the mountains gold. Somewhere behind him, a telegram moved over wire, carrying words that couldn't be taken back. Somewhere ahead, Rose Ellen Hartley hung her father's bullwhip by the door and counted days. 41 left. The federal marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, riding a bay gelding and wearing a badge that caught the sunlight like a promise. His name was Harrison, and he had the look of a man who'd seen enough lies to recognize truth when it showed up with surveying tools and county records. Jacob met him at the edge of town, where the road forked toward the Hartley homestead. Doc Calloway was already there, his medical bag in one hand and his evidence crate in the other. Maria Santos arrived in her wagon, her ledger wrapped in oilcloth. "This everyone?" Marshal Harrison asked. "Everyone who will testify," Jacob said. "Then let's make it official." The marshal dismounted. "Courthouse. 1 hour. I want Wexler there, and I want the county clerk, and I want anyone else who's got a stake in this." Word spread through Trinity Falls like wildfire. By the time the hour was up, half the town had gathered on the courthouse steps. The spring air smelled like mud and possibility, like something frozen, finally starting to break. Marshal Harrison stood on the top step, his back to the courthouse door. Beside him stood Jacob with his surveying maps, Doc with his crate, Maria with her ledger. Below them, the crowd pressed close. Townspeople, ranchers, shopkeepers, children dismissed from school to witness history. And in the front, standing small and straight in her good boots, Rose Ellen Hartley. Wexler arrived with Tyler Brooks and Judge Morrison, flanked by his hired men. They pushed through the crowd like they owned it, which until this moment they probably had. "What's the meaning of this, Marshal?" Wexler's voice carried easy, confident. "I'm a busy man." "Then I'll make it quick." Harrison pulled out a document, unfolded it with deliberate care. "Federal complaints been filed regarding your land claim on the Hartley homestead. Allegations of fraudulent boundaries in violation of the Treaty of 1855 grazing allotment." Wexler laughed. "That's absurd. My claim's been properly filed and registered with the county, with a county clerk who happens to be your brother-in-law." Harrison looked at Tyler Brooks. "That right, Mr. Brooks?" Tyler's face went red. "That don't make it fraud." "No, but this might." Jacob stepped forward, unrolling his survey maps. "I surveyed the Hartley property and Mr. Wexler's claim 3 nights ago. His eastern boundary extends 3 acres into federal grazing land that can't be privately claimed under territorial law." Wexler's smile didn't waver. "Surveying errors happen. I'll have my own survey done. I used tools calibrated by the Territorial Survey Office in 1879. Jacob interrupted. "Same tools my father used to map this valley. The measurements are exact. And even if they weren't," Marshal Harrison said, "there's the matter of the debt claims." He nodded to Maria. She stepped forward, opening her ledger. Her hands were steady. "Thomas Hartley's account. Every transaction from 1879 to 1881. Final balance. Paid in full. November 1881. She looked directly at Wexler. You claimed the Hartleys owed you $240 for feed. There's no such debt in my records. Your records aren't official. Mine are. Doc Calloway opened his crate. 6 families, 6 foreclosures, all filed within weeks of a family tragedy, death, illness, injury, all claiming debts that appeared out of nowhere. He pulled out papers, held them up, and all signed by the same county clerk, using the same legal language, the same amounts down to the dollar. The crowd murmured. Wexler's smile was gone now, his jaw tight. This is a coordinated attack, Judge Morrison said, stepping forward. These people have conspired to tell the truth. The voice came from behind them. Reverend Thomas walked up the courthouse steps, moving slow but certain. He stopped beside Marshal Harrison, his face pale but resolute. Mr. Wexler came to me 2 months ago, the Reverend said, his voice carrying across the square. He asked me to write a letter declaring the Hartley family unfit to hold their homestead. Morally deficient, he called it, said it would help with the foreclosure. He looked at the crowd. He offered me money, and he reminded me that this church sits on land his family donated. That's a lie. Wexler's composure cracked. I have the letter. Reverend Thomas pulled out a folded paper. The one he wanted me to sign. I kept it. Couldn't bring myself to burn evidence of my own cowardice. He handed it to the marshal. Harrison read it, his expression darkening. This is witness intimidation and fraud. The marshal looked at Wexler. In its federal jurisdiction the moment it crossed treaty land. Wexler's hired men shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The crowd tensed. Don't. Harrison's hand rested on his own sidearm. You boys pull iron on a federal officer, you'll hang. The hired men froze. The moment stretched, tight as a wire. Then Rose Ellen stepped forward. She was 9 years old, small enough to be overlooked, but she moved through the crowd like she owned the ground beneath her feet. In her hand, she carried her father's bullwhip, coiled and ready. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at Wexler. My father saved a man's life, she said, her voice clear. He carried him 6 miles through a blizzard. He built a homestead with his own hands. He paid every debt he owed. She uncoiled the whip slightly. You tried to take that from me, tried to make me forget what kind of man he was. Wexler looked down at her, something like fear finally showing in his eyes. Rose Ellen raised the whip. The crowd stepped back. Jacob tensed, ready to intervene. She cracked it once, straight up into the air. The sound split the spring morning like thunder. Wexler's hired men scattered, backing away from a 9-year-old girl with a bullwhip and nothing left to lose. The crowd laughed. The sound rolled across the square, weeks of fear finally breaking. Marshal Harrison smiled. Mr. Wexler, you're under arrest for land fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to violate federal treaty provisions. He looked at Tyler Brooks. You too, Mr. Brooks. Judge Morrison, you'll be answering questions in Helena. This isn't over, Wexler said as the marshal put him in irons. I have lawyers. I have money. You have nothing. Jacob stepped forward, meeting Wexler's eyes. Thomas Hartley saved my life 8 years ago. That's a debt, and I'm paying it now. The marshal led Wexler away. The crowd parted, silent now, watching justice happen in daylight for once. Rose Ellen stood at the courthouse steps, her father's whip coiled in her hands, and for the first time in months, she let herself breathe. Aunt Ida appeared beside her, held up by Maria Santos. The old woman was crying, but smiling too. Your father would be proud, child. Rose Ellen looked at Jacob, at Doc, at Maria, at Reverend Thomas, at all the people who'd finally chosen right over safe. He'd be proud of all of us, she said. The legal paperwork took 3 weeks. Federal charges moved like winter ice, slow, grinding, inevitable. Marshal Harrison stayed in Trinity Falls, taking statements, collecting evidence, building a case that would put Wexler away for years. Tyler Brooks turned witness in exchange for a lighter sentence. Judge Morrison resigned and left Montana Territory before the marshal could finish his investigation. The hired men disappeared like smoke, heading for Wyoming or Idaho or wherever men went when their money dried up. And the Hartley homestead stayed right where it was. The county clerk's office, under new management now, re-registered Thomas Hartley's original land patent. The document Rose Ellen had brought months ago, the one Tyler Brooks had claimed was incomplete, turned out to be perfectly legal all along. 40 acres, clear title, no debt, Doc Calloway visited the homestead on a warm morning in early May, when the sage was blooming and the creek ran clear. He found Aunt Ida sitting in the sun, a quilt across her lap, her breathing easier than it had been in months. "You're looking better," he said. "I'm dying," she replied matter-of-factly, "but I'm dying in my own home. That's better." Doc sat beside her, his black bag at his feet. "How long you figure you got?" "Weeks, maybe a month if the weather stays warm." She smiled. "Long enough to see Rose Ellen settled proper." The Brennans offered to take her in, as trustees, legal-like, until she's of age. "I know," Old Man Brennan told me himself. Aunt Ida looked toward the cabin, where Rose Ellen was hanging washing on the line. "She'll have family, real family. That's all Thomas wanted for her." 2 weeks later, on a morning that smelled like wildflowers and new grass, Aunt Ida passed in her sleep. "Peaceful," Doc said. "No pain at the end." They buried her next to Thomas Hartley, on a rise overlooking the homestead. Half of Trinity Falls showed up for the funeral. People who'd turned away in winter, now standing with hats in hands, ashamed and trying to make it right. Rose Ellen stood at the graveside in her good boots, dry-eyed and straight-backed. She'd cried all her tears in private. In public, she was her father's daughter. Strong, quiet, enduring. After the service, Old Man Brennan approached her with papers in hand. Legal documents signed and sealed. "Your aunt deeded the property to you," he said gently. "With my family named as trustees until you're 18. That means you've got a home and someone to look after the legal side of things. But the land's yours, Rose Ellen. Always will be." She took the papers, running her fingers over her father's name. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank my son. He's the one who wouldn't let it go." Jacob stood a little ways off, hat in hands, looking uncomfortable with the attention. Rose Ellen walked over to him. "My father saved your life," she said. "He did. And you saved mine." Jacob crouched down so they were eye to eye. "Your father told mine something when he brought me home that night. He said, well, don't want payment. Just pass it on when your time comes." He smiled. "Guess this was my time." Rose Ellen threw her arms around his neck and held on tight. Jacob patted her back awkwardly, this 23-year-old man who'd learned how to fight with surveying tools and patience instead of fists. "You'll stay with us until you're grown," he said. "Help around the ranch, go to school, learn what you need to learn, and when you're 18, you come back here if you want, or you go wherever you please. Your choice." "I'll come back," she said. "This is my father's land. Then we'll keep it safe for you." Spring turned to summer. The Hartley cabin sat empty but cared for, Jacob riding over once a week to check on it, to make repairs, to keep the sage from swallowing it whole. Rose Ellen lived with the Brennans, learning to break horses and mend fence and read the land the way her father had. School started again in September. She walked into that one-room schoolhouse in her good boots, carrying a new slate and a spine of iron. Mrs. Grissom was gone, replaced by a young teacher from Helena who didn't care whose cousin she was or wasn't. Rose Ellen took a desk in the front row this time. When the other children tried to whisper, she turned and looked at them with eyes that had seen foreclosure notices and federal marshals and men arrested in daylight. The whispers stopped. At Christmas, the Brennan family gathered for dinner. Jacob and his father, Maria Santos and her daughter Doc Calloway, Reverend Thomas, and Rose Ellen, 10 years old now, sitting at the table like she belonged. Because she did. Old Man Brennan raised his glass. "To Thomas Hartley, who taught us what passing it on really means." They drank to that, to debts paid in kindness, to justice that came slow but came true, to winter finally breaking into spring. Outside, snow was starting to fall, gentle and clean, but inside, the fire burned warm, and the table was full, and a girl who'd stood alone on courthouse steps 6 months ago now sat surrounded by family. Not the family she was born with, the family she'd earned, and who'd earned her right back. Rose Ellen looked around the table, at all these faces who'd chosen right when it mattered, and felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like home. Her father's land waited for her, patient as stone. The cabin would stand, the creek would run, the sage would bloom every spring, and when her time came to pass it on, she'd be ready. 9 years passed like seasons, fast when you weren't watching, slow when you were. Rose Ellen Hartley stood in front of the Trinity Falls schoolhouse, 18 now, wearing a simple dress and sturdy boots that had been resold twice. The building looked smaller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just grown. 30 children sat at their desks, watching her with the careful attention children give to someone who might matter. She held up an old boot. The sole was split clear through, held together with twine that had long since rotted away. "This belonged to a girl who walked 4 miles every morning," she said. Some of you laughed. Some of you looked away. The children shifted. One boy, Jacob Brennan's nephew, 10 years old now, raised his hand. "What happened to her?" Rose Ellen smiled. "She learned something important, that the people who matter aren't the ones who watch you fall. They're the ones who kneel in the mud to help you stand." She set the boot on her desk and pulled out her father's pocket watch. The case was still dented, the mechanism still true. She opened it, read the inscription for the 1,000th time. "Pass it on when your time comes, T.H." "My father wrote that," she said, "and he meant it. Someone helped him once, so he helped others. Someone helped me, so now I help you." Through the window, she could see Jacob unloading firewood from his wagon. His father sat beside him, old but still steady. They waved. She waved back. "Today we're learning about land patents and surveying," she continued, "about what it means when law meets conscience. Because someday you'll have to choose. Stand silent in the corner or speak when someone needs you." Outside, the creek ran clear. Wild roses bloomed where a condemned sign once hung. The Hartley homestead sat on its rise, cabin repaired, garden growing, smoke rising from the chimney where she'd cooked dinner tonight. Her father's land, her school, a debt repaid in seasons. One of the children raised her hand. "Miss Hartley, what did you choose?" Rose Ellen looked at the girl, young, uncertain, looking for an answer that would make sense of the world. "I chose to remember," she said. "To remember every person who stood up when it mattered, and to be that person for someone else when my time came." She closed the watch with a gentle click. "Now, let's talk about surveying compasses and how to measure truth." The lesson began. Outside, spring moved into summer, the way it always did. The land endured, the debts were paid, and in a one-room schoolhouse in Montana, a girl who'd once stood in the corner now stood at the front, teaching children that courage was just fear that had decided to move forward anyway. Justice wasn't loud. It was a man riding 60 miles because someone once carried him 6. It was a woman keeping ledgers when no one was watching. It was a preacher choosing shame over silence, finally. It was boots that held and land that stayed, and children who learned that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing were the same thing. Rose Ellen taught until the sun dropped low, painting the mountains gold. When the last child left, she locked the schoolhouse and walked home. 4 miles, same as always, but in the opposite direction now. Her father's bullwhip hung by the cabin door. She touched it in passing, a ritual, a remembering. Inside, the table was set for one. But tomorrow, the Brennans would come for Sunday dinner. And next week, Maria's grandchildren. And the week after that, whoever needed feeding. The door stayed open, the fire stayed warm, the debts kept passing forward, the way her father had intended. Outside, the first sergeants appeared. The sage released its evening scent. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. Rose Ellen sat by the window with her father's watch in her hand, listening to the land breathe, grateful for every hard-won acre of it.